Hi, everybody. This is Marlene with Eerie News, and today is February 17, 2025. Monday, February 17, 2025. Hope you all had a lovely St. Valentine's Day. So, here we are, the second month of the year, 2025. And our first story is out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories and is titled The Psychopath Story. In August 2024, the Salinas Valley State Prison denied a man convicted of a crime committed in 1973 his 15th request for parole. In of itself, this is not unusual. However, the nature of the relationship that developed between him and one of his victims engendered a book and movie during the 1980s. The story also details how a deeply disturbed and dangerous individual can masquerade and manipulate members of society that have no idea they are staring evil in the face. On February 27, 1973, deputies with the Tulare County Sheriff's Office received a call about a crime that turned out to be the murder of William Ashlock, an executive from Los Angeles. Gerald Daniel Walker would eventually be tried and convicted for the crime and sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Even if he would have ever secured parole, he still has a 50-year sentence in federal prison pending. This is a strange story that started in February 1973 in a ranch house at the foot of the Sierra Nevadas on 600 acres. The following was excerpted from the book A Death in California, published in 1981. At 10 minutes before noon on February 23, 1973, a handsome, well-dressed man carrying a carved pipe stepped into the reception room at Daly and Associates, an advertising agency on Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles. He said he was a reporter for the Los Angeles Times. He said he had a lunch date with Bill Ashlock, an executive with the firm, to interview him for an article on the city's 10 most eligible bachelors. He said his name was Taylor Wright. The lunch lasted nearly 4 hours, which made Bill late getting to Hope Masters' house. He was living most of the time with Hope in Beverly Hills, though he still kept his bachelor apartment downtown. Bill and Hope, who was a member of a socially prominent family, were planning to spend the weekend together at her mother's ranch on 500 mountainous acres in the shadow of the Sierra Nevadas. The delay irritated Hope, and the news that the reporter would be driving up the next day to take pictures for his piece did not improve her mood. But by the time she and Bill were turning up the winding road to the ranch, she had relaxed, as she always did in this secluded place, with only the main house and the caretaker's cottage, a world away from the clamor and the contradictions of her life in Beverly Hills. Like Bill Ashlock, Hope Masters was in the process of her second divorce, and her broken marriages exemplified some of those contradictions. She had eloped at age 16 with a boy next door and had 2 children before she was 20. She divorced her husband because she considered him a boring stay-at-home and married a dashing young public relations man, Tom Masters. They had a child. Then she and Tom had separated because she considered him too much of a playboy. Hope and her children lived in one of the most expensive residential areas in the United States. While her income of $435 a month, some from each husband, some from her mother, entitled her to food stamps. At 31, Hope was just over 5 feet and weighed 90 pounds. She had smoky green eyes and a small-boned oval face, champagne-colored hair streaming past her shoulders, and she looked more like a sultry teenager than the mother of 3 children. Bill was 40 and looked 25. He was passionate about fitness, usually lunching on yogurt and jogging 3 miles a day. Hope recalls the moment she was introduced by Bill. "Hopi, this is Taylor Wright." "Hi, Taylor. Where did you get that terrific tan?" "I've been skiing." Bill sat on the sofa with Taylor in the rocking chair opposite. Hope set out wine and cheese, and she and Taylor talked, with Bill mostly listening. Hope was a compulsive talker. She says she talked so much to Taylor about her life and problems. Her mother and her stepfather, a corporation lawyer who Hope said was as stiff and unbending as an American eagle, that later she couldn't remember everything she'd said. Taylor said he was from the Middle West but that he now lived in Paris and hadn't been in the United States for 3 years. This journalistic assignment was just something to do until he went abroad again. Bill made a fire and they sat up till nearly dawn, drinking wine and talking. They talked of their past relationships and of their future. What happened in the hours, in the days and weeks that lay ahead is one of the strangest and most perplexing stories in the annals of American crime. It is a story whose principal actors, Hope Masters and the man who called himself Taylor Wright, represented vastly different levels of society. One was a complex and vulnerable member of a rich, prominent family. The other, as it turned out, was at once a bright, persuasive charmer and an unpredictable, menacing force. The actions of each of them proved often to be totally implausible and difficult to comprehend. Some, some of the questions the case raises will probably never be fully answered, matters that go beyond one murder case into fundamental questions of human behavior, its dynamics, imperatives, and especially its ambiguity. But scores of interviews conducted over the past year with family members, detectives, defense attorneys, a county prosecutor, judges, and prison officials do provide insight and perhaps answers to all that happened, why it happened, and whether it reflected a system of fairness and justice. End quote. William Ashlock was found wrapped in a bedspread and shot in the head in a bedroom of the River Valley Ranch in Springville, California. His body was discovered after Tulare County Sheriff's Office received a call from Beverly Hills that something terrible had happened at River Valley Ranch. Walker, using the name of Taylor Wright, which was a name he stole from a jewelry salesman who he had nearly beaten to death in Michigan, told the sheriff's office that Hope had witnessed Ashlock's murder and her life was in danger. Walker had murdered Ashlock the first night he stayed there. He tied up Hope and alternated between threatening her and pledging to protect her. When she asked why he killed Bill, he explained that he was a hitman and his real target was her. He'd been hired, he claimed, by Hope's second husband, with whom she was in the middle of a divorce, to do a Sharon Tate-like massacre, and her children also had to be killed. After Walker called police, Hope contacted her parents, who were partial owners of the property, telling them she had witnessed a hit and had been raped by the killer. Over the weekend, Walker spun wild tales of guilt and motives, ultimately persuading Masters to corroborate his alibi. Trapped in the beginning stages of Stockholm Syndrome, she agreed, though her cooperation would later cause her to become an outcast from local society. Hope Niven Masters is the daughter of Waldemar Van Cott Niven, a prominent Beverly Hills attorney and former husband of Lucy Estelle Doheny, granddaughter of the late oilman E.L. Doheny. This family had their own brush with mystery and scandal when Ned Doheny Jr. and his secretary Hugh Plunkett were found dead in a murder-suicide crime in 1928. Hope's father was one of 4 owners of the Spring Valley Ranch. In March, police ran down Walker in North Hollywood where he was using Ashlock's credit cards. Initially, both Walker and Hope were arrested. However, she would go on to testify against him. At first, Hope refused to identify the man who'd raped her and killed her fiancé, and to this day people can't agree if it was because she was afraid of him or in love with him. In 1974, Walker was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. He would also be convicted of the rape and brainwashing of Hope Masters, but it was a complicated relationship since Hope visited him twice in prison. However, this was part of his M.O. Walker already had a rap sheet that dated back over 2 decades. In 1954, he was convicted of armed robbery in Florida, in 1958 of armed robbery in Ohio, and in 1969 of shooting an Illinois state trooper in the head. He was also a suspect in various violent crimes, including murder across the United States. While serving time in Ohio for armed robbery, he had seduced and married the prison warden's private secretary. He was paroled on that charge and even had a baby with his secretary. During his incarceration in Illinois, he manipulated his radical legal aid attorney to help him escape from the hospital prison ward in Chicago by faking a medical condition. She even accompanied him when he robbed a gas station at gunpoint. 3 months after Hope Masters visited Walker in prison, he seduced and married Olivia, the prison dietitian. He involved her in escape in several escape plots and frivolous lawsuits. She aided him in the 1980s to acquire brucine poison, which he intended to use against the judge and prosecutors who convicted him. Then he was involved in a mail order scam from his prison cell. In 1991, FBI profiler Robert Ressler interviewed him in prison. Walker boasted of having committed many crimes that were still unsolved, and for which he never even came under suspicion for. Now, at the age of 93, he has spent the majority of his life incarcerated, where hopefully he will remain. So, you would think, well, this guy is 93 and he's been turned down for the 15th time. Okay, and you would think, well, what? You would think he's too old to do anything. You never know. And that he's a charmer, that's an understatement. But it makes you wonder how all these women fall into and believe his story, you know. And I mean, it's not like, oh, they just believe like a little lie, like, oh, the big giant whoppers that they even marry this guy. Here's this girl runs off with him after, I don't know, supposedly brainwashes her that he was gonna protect her and that she was a target of a hit. And that's, I mean, talk about the bigger the lie. It's like, this guy, yeah, thank God he's gonna stay behind bars and hopefully die there, because he's too dangerous to get out. And I hate to say it, I can't believe women fall for that. It's not the lie. Anybody can fall for a lie. It's just like, you would think that you would, if somebody's behind bars, that you would think their credibility would be like in the negative, but c'est la vie, mon ami. All right, next story, also out of Stranger Than Fiction stories, is titled The Screaming Queen and the Ghost of Hampton Court. There are two ghosts that are well known to haunt Hampton Court. They were both English queens and wives of Henry VIII. One is Jane Seymour, who died shortly after giving birth to Prince Edward, and the other is the shrieking ghost of Catherine Howard, executed for adultery. However, there is another who finds no peace, and her only downfall was loyalty to the royal family. Hampton Court was once the property of Cardinal Wolsey. Henry VIII, who took Hampton Court from Wolsey, was believed to have peopled the place with its many ghosts. Jane Seymour died in the palace soon after her infant son Edward VI had been christened. Her spectre, clothed in white, has been seen to come out of the door of the Queen's apartments. These were the rooms occupied by Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. Jane is said to wander about with a lighted taper in her hand on the Silver Stick stairs, which once led up to a room where she gave birth to her son and died. She is seen on the anniversary of these events that occurred on October 24th, 1537. In 1900, it was reported that Mr. Haynes, who was copying some French tapestries at Hampton Court Palace, was driven away after repeatedly witnessing the apparition of a woman's hand. Working there during the daytime hours, he described a feminine hand wearing a diamond marquise ring on the forefinger, which would thrust out through the tapestry where there was no opening. It was believed the hand belonged to the ghost of Lady Jane Seymour, and the peculiar ring is painted in several of her portraits. She had been seen in Hampton Court before and in the times of James II. Masses were said for her unhappy soul, that she might walk no more. However, it seems she did not lie quietly in her grave. That's an understatement. Jane Seymour shared a great grandmother with Elizabeth Cheney, Lady Say, with Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, and Catherine Howard, his fifth wife, both doomed to the executioner's axe. Now, that was quite interesting that all of them basically had the same ancestress. Two of them ended up getting killed, and this poor lady, well, she didn't get executed, but she died like 2 weeks after she gave birth. So there was something about that bloodline that was not, its destiny to become Queen of England was not in their stars. Very, very, very interesting. Okay, let's continue. The Haunted Gallery earned its reputation based on an episode that took place with Queen Catherine Howard. She had been confined to her rooms after Henry was told of her misconduct by the Archbishop of Canterbury. He planned to ride off to Oatlands Palace in Surrey, never to set eyes on her again. Fearing that once he left she would never be able to persuade him to spare her, She escaped from her chamber and ran shrieking down the gallery, trying to reach the king, who was hearing mass in the chapel. Just before reaching the doors, she was seized by guards and forcibly removed back to her room. Henry, who heard her screams, continued in his devotions, apparently unmoved by her pleas. Catherine was then exiled to Sion Abbey, a disused convent, while her crimes were investigated. Two of her former lovers, Derham and Culpeper, were tortured and confessed to having had sex with her. They were tried and condemned to death for treason. Derham was hung, drawn, and quartered, while Culpeper was beheaded. The heads of both men were displayed on pikes on London Bridge. Catherine did not face trial, but was condemned by an act of attainder which Henry himself signed. She shared the fate of her cousin, Anne Boleyn, and she was beheaded at 9 a.m. on February 13, 1542, at the Tower of London. Even though Catherine's exact year of birth is not known, it is believed she was 19 years of age or younger when she died. Lady Eastlake and Mrs. Cavendish Boyle, who were staying at Hampton Court at the turn of the 20th century, saw near the Queen's staircase a white figure with a despairing face. It was that of Catherine Howard. Catherine was not the only execution that day. Jane Boleyn, Viscountess Rochford, sister-in-law of Anne Boleyn, was also beheaded. Jane Boleyn had been a member of Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon's household. She had a hand in the rumors that her husband, George Boleyn, had an incestuous affair with his sister Anne. This was one of the pretexts that led to their execution. Anne Boleyn was a lady-in-waiting to Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, and ultimately to Catherine Howard. She was held with Catherine Howard and accused of facilitating Catherine's sexual indiscretions. In the intervening months, while being incessantly questioned, she could not be tortured since she was an aristocrat. She went insane. Insanity should have saved her from execution, but King Henry wanted to punish her anyway, and made up a law that allowed him to send her to the block despite her mental state. She was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula at the Tower of London alongside Catherine Howard. Close to the bodies of Anne Boleyn and George Boleyn, Catherine Howard's ghost is seen in the gallery, dressed in white, coming towards the door of the royal pew. She then hurries back with a look of despair and uttering unearthly shrieks until she passes through the doors at the end of the gallery. Another Hampton Court ghost is that of Dame Sybil Penn, a.k.a. the Grey Lady. She had served 4 Tudor kings, and she was Edward VI's dry nurse. She went on to serve Elizabeth I as Lady of the Queen's Bedchamber. She devotedly attended the Queen when she contracted smallpox. Elizabeth recovered, but Sybil caught the disease herself and died in 1562. She was buried at the Church of St. Mary's in the village of Hampton, near the palace. In 1829, the church was pulled down in order to rebuild it after it was hit by lightning during a storm. In the process, her tomb was desecrated. Immediately afterward, strange noises as of a woman working at a spinning wheel and mutterings were heard through the wall of one of the rooms in the southwest wing of the palace. In the late 1800s, a search was being made by the Board of Works when an ancient and unknown chamber was discovered in which an antique spinning wheel and some other things were found. Since then, the specter of Sybil Penn is said to have appeared to a sentry, and the whirring of a spinning wheel has again been heard. She appears in the corridor of the state apartments and clock court at the palace. In the 1880s, there were frequent accounts of seeing a tall, gaunt, gray form around the haunted room and gallery, exactly corresponding with the appearance of the effigy on the tomb, and of the low whirring of an unseen spinning wheel, a sepulchral voice, and a stealthy tread. There was also another surprisingly well-authentic sighting in 1905. In November 1871, 2 male skeletons in shallow graves were unearthed under a cloister in Fountain Court at Hampton Palace during a routine excavation. Their discovery brought huge relief to the palace resident, an elderly woman living in a nearby apartment. She had complained of constant banging and knocking on her walls, but no one had believed her. All disturbances ceased when the remains were properly interred. It has been suggested that the anonymous men were victims of Roundhead villainy during the Civil Wars. They may have been hastily buried in unmarked graves, which are concealed during Run's building of the Baroque Palace in 1689. In October 2003, the palace CCTV captured the image of a ghostly figure, apparently flinging open a fire door. The door had opened by itself on 3 consecutive days, and the apparition was seen only on the second day. Security staff remained baffled. And that last one in 2003, I remember that made all the news that they couldn't explain. And it's a pretty horrific looking figure, whatever it is. It's like a skeletal face, but yeah. So there you go. Yeah, it's no kidding that he peopled this palace with its ghosts. And from what I understand, when Henry VIII lay dying, he had some kind of contrition about these women that he had sent to death because basically, remember, they were being accused of incest, infidelity, and basically all he wanted was a divorce in order to have a male heir. So, and I guess he realized that what he had done was not quite, well, no, it wasn't. It was far from kingly, but c'est la vie. And it's extraordinary because that is what he's most remembered for. 6 wives, and that they, with the exception of Anne of Cleves and the last one, they kind of were not happy. They did not end have a good ending. Well, Catherine of Aragon, she died she was older, but again. Anyway, still on Stranger Than Fiction stories, our next story is The Skeletons in the Cave. In July 1945, the Battle of Okinawa took place, leaving over 200,000 dead, among them over one-third of civilians who lived on the island. Okinawans had been forced to commit suicide by the Japanese military or be executed. Lawlessness was rampant on the island, and refugees lived in the hills. A month later, atomic bombs would fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and amid this turmoil, the disappearance of 3 young Marines was barely noticed. Their names are James D. Robinson from Savannah, Georgia, John M. Smith from Cincinnati, and Isaac Stokes from Chicago. Initially, they were listed by military as deserters, and then they were declared missing in action. They were all 19 years old and belonged to the 37th Marine Depot Unit. The remains and graves of military personnel lost in battle are many times unrecovered. This appeared to be the fate of these 3 Marines until 1988. A rugged trail leads through steep jungle foothills near Naga, Okinawa. The area is not populated by large fruit bats and poisonous snakes, but in 1945 it was used by refugees that were hiding out in the area. They decided to use this well-hidden cave that measured 6 feet wide at the entrance and about 50 feet deep to deposit the bodies of the 3 men. It appears a local population were aware of the remains that were in the cave and who they were. The reason for this was that these men had been killed by local Okinawans with the assistance of 2 Japanese soldiers who were hiding in the jungle, and this information had been passed on throughout the 50-plus years they had lain in their secret tomb. It was said that the 3 Marines were killed for raping and abusing local Okinawan women. Despite the justification they felt in murdering them, the Japanese men who killed them knew they had to get rid of the bodies that during wartime would bring retaliation from the Americans. The cave they used afterward became known as Kurombo Gama, which translates as Cave of the Negroes. All 3 men were black. Marine Marine Corps officials in Okinawa and Washington said they knew of no rapes by American servicemen in Okinawa at the end of the war, and their records do not list war crimes committed by Marines in Okinawa. General John G. Castlellaw, deputy commander of the Marines force in Okinawa, said that during the past 30 years in which he completed numerous assignments on the island, he had never heard of any accusations of widespread rape by American servicemen in Okinawa. This was a quote as to claims of rape of servicemen raping Okinawan women. Was it true? Was it not true? How common was it? And in this case, these 3 young men were killed and dumped in the cave because they were accused. As a matter of fact, one of the stories is that they had become so confident that they would come into the village even unarmed. And that's when the villagers and the 2 Japanese soldiers took advantage and they were killed and dumped in the cave. But let's continue. All those who had witnessed the killing of the Marines are long since dead. What was left are just stories retold to later generations who lived in the area. Kijun Kishimoto, was in his late 20s in 1945, and he grew up in the village of Katsuyama. He was not there when the Americans were killed, but was aware of the incident. In 1997, perhaps not wanting to carry the secret to his grave, he contacted Setsuko Inafuku, a tour guide for Kadena Air Base, who would take hikers to war sites on the island. That year they both searched for the cave, but it wasn't until August, when a typhoon blew down a tree that had been hiding the entrance of the cave, that they were able to find it. Setsuku reported to a historian at the base the rediscovery of Kurumbo Gama and described that the bones were still visible. The bodies were dug up in 1998, but it wasn't until 2000 that they were identified by the Army Identification Laboratory in Hawaii. After so many years, the cause of death could not be determined. All three men were interred in Arlington National Cemetery. To this day, the caves continue to surrender the dead. 116 sets of remains were recovered in 1998. Little wonder that Okinawa has a reputation of being very haunted. The Okinawa Lime Cave Association is a nonprofit group dedicated to exploring caves and recovering World War II era remains. As of 2017, they have recovered more than 2,000 sets of remains, including those of Americans. The group also discovered the popular tourist attraction Okinawa World in 1974. In 2017, they explored under Amachiyo-gama, a cave beneath Nanjo City. They brought up a bag filled with skulls and bone fragments believed to be from an Imperial Japanese soldier from World War II. There were also unexploded ordnance in the cave, which is under a hill that has a senior daycare facility on it. In 2007, they found 9 pieces of human bones at Shiharo Sanabaru Cave on Ishigaki Island. Eventually, 19 sets of remains were found in the cave. They were found to be 27,000 years old, the oldest human remains found in Japan, and date to the Old Stone Age. So there you go. Now, how did some of these people end up? I mean, a lot of mystery there as far as who and what were in those caves, right? Who and what were in those caves.